from just outside the Empire City at the crossroads to the northeast. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Wherever you are and whenever you are, this is your premier podcast for all things unknown, not media, and I'm your host, JP. Welcome to Not Media. And today, for episode 9, I have my very good friend Jesse here, and we are going to be discussing, of all pleasant subjects, serial killers and a book he had put me onto or recommended me to read that deviates a little bit from the normal world of the unknown that I've been covering, say, within the past couple episodes, which is we have with the humanoids and the aliens and the UAPs, and even we did afterlife, possible truth about the afterlife. But welcome, Jesse, to Not Media. How you doing today?
Good. Glad to be here.
Awesome. Yeah, glad to have you on. So just a quick a history. I can give a quick history of Jess. I'm going to kind of, just because I provide myself with some anonymity, you know what I'm saying, as far as as far as what I do in law enforcement. I'll provide Jesse, unless Jesse wants to give you guys anything else. I'm just going to say Jesse is a teacher, and he does a lot of reading, and he's and his specialty is in English, so he's always staying on top of stuff, reading good books, and sometimes he's putting me onto good books, and we go back many years from the days that long before I was in law enforcement, and back to the days when I was still a kid skateboarding and playing in rock bands. So if you want to add anything else, Jess, like, I'm just gonna kind of like I said, I'll give you the courtesy, because, and I kind of give myself a little bit of that here, especially because I'm currently in law enforcement, and I know we just live in tumultuous times right now, and I have enough to worry about showing up to work every day and not getting myself hurt or killed or any of my partners. So I try not to talk too much about what goes on at work, for me. But sometimes I'll just throw a couple words or two in, just to say that it reflects on some of my experience with life and how it affects my research. So
Yeah, well, that's pretty the gist of it. I mean, like you said, I'm an English background, so reading, close analysis of literature, books, all that type of thing has been something I do. I also, in my teaching, I teach English, but I also just within the last few years started teaching a true crime class. So I've been really knee deep into the true crime world, even more so. I mean, I've always been a fan of it. But I took it to another level once I started teaching this course, which we offer at the school as a elective option. So a lot of our senior students like to take it. And so I've been more than ever, real deep into the world of true crime. And that's kind of probably why I ended up somewhat, partly, I wouldn't say completely, but partly how I stumbled onto this book and why it intrigued me. So that's
very
pretty
cool.
Much,
Yeah. And I know you had told me that, and it's like, it just goes to show, like, life and the essence of life, and how we can just get so caught up in just what we're doing. And I've been so caught up in everything I've been doing with my training and police work and this and this and that, and it's just the world of living life. So I know we had touched on this before. We don't get to hang out a whole lot anymore, just because of all the nature of life. But I know you had told me this before. I didn't realize that you had gotten so much into it, though. So that's very cool, because I definitely, I didn't really even consider this angle, honestly, when I started this podcast. I was like, because I've been, my background, and from back in the years like 2007, 2008, when I first discovered the whole UFO phenomenon, how I got couldn't get it. Back then it was considered like super weird, so I just kind of got into it like knee deep. And I'm sure, like, you were like one of the people that kind of stood by me throughout the whole thing, and actually listened to some of the stuff I had to say, when a lot of people back in that 2007, 2008 area would probably just start nodding their head and rolling their eyes at you. So this is a cool angle, and this is a cool subject to get into. And I believe, if as there's certainly a fascination with this now. I don't know what it is, but I don't know if it was COVID, I don't know if just people had enough time to sit at home and start getting bored and like not that this isn't fascinating because I believe, there's always been when I talk to people fascination about this, but you've seen this whole resurgence of these like Netflix series of like John Gacy, um what was the other guy, the Candyman, I forget his last name, Dean, I forget his last name, but there was a guy that they called the Candyman from Texas. There was Gacy. They did that Clown on the Candyman. You were telling me about that. Then they had this whole thing on Jeffrey Dahmer. That show. Did you get a chance to watch that series?
Which one? The one on Netflix that was like the reenactment?
Yes, the Jeffrey Dahmer one.
That was, yeah, I could definitely. We actually watched that in the class, part of it, and yeah,
Oh,
the acting was outstanding. I mean, I tell
yeah.
my students, like, if you didn't know, if you hadn't seen Jeffrey Dahmer in interviews, I've seen plenty of it, so you saw who he was, his mannerisms, his affect. This guy captured him to a T. I mean, it was just so impressive. I thought overall it was good. It was very good. It did stray in some serious ways from the truth of what the Dahmer backstory is. But I think in terms of motive and what he did to his victims, it stayed true to the story. So, but it was
Okay.
good.
Yeah, I didn't really have any interest in that story much, but I was like, a friend of mine, one of my police friends, put me onto it, and he said, "Dude, you just gotta check this series out." So I watched it, and I'm like, "Whoa, the acting on that was phenomenal." And then because the acting was so good, because the storyline is so strange, and it kind of like, I don't know, I don't know what the fascination with this. I think it might touch on like a part of us that we all potentially could have, or the fact that we all potentially could be victims. I mean, what do
Yeah,
you think it is?
I think
Like the
I think
fascination.
totally. I think totally that both of those are great points. I think we know potentially, yeah, we have a side to us that is violent. We have a side to us that is predatory. I mean, whether we like to think about it, or I'm sure we try not to nurture it, but it's undeniably there. So I think we're drawn to this side that we don't get much, you know, moments in our life that are socially acceptable to explore.
Yeah.
And so that's there going on. But then the fact that you yourself could be a victim, and then wanting to feel like you want to know how to prevent that, or to know when you're around someone of that nature. And I think it's just, yeah, I think it's the intrigue of it, because it's just something that's just, there's no clear explanations as much as we try. We're so logically minded, in our thinking, that when we get to something like serial killers, there aren't these clear-cut answers of how does someone act so completely out of the norm of behavior that we expect from another human being. How is this possible? And it
Yeah.
begins to delve into the realm of the unknown, and theory that I think we naturally want to find answers to. It's something that we really haven't completely tied up. It's not something we have a
Yes.
clear understanding of to this day.
Yeah. I certainly agree with you, and I think that's like hitting the nail on the head as far as what it is about the human psyche and our history. Maybe, I even like part of me even thought like, is it the whole like tribal essence of humanity and the fact that we would have warring factions that gave us all that like, possible instinct to kill because, throughout history, we've all had to, at some point be in a group or a tribe. And then at some point there was another threat of another group or tribe. So there'd be some sort of element to have to be violent if you needed to survive. And maybe sometimes, it's like, when you see these dysfunctional relationships with people who grow up in like broken households and how like certain people are attracted to people who are abusive to them, like maybe there's like a broken part of our psyche. People can get broken, and it taps into that part of that deep dark part of people that has that ability to hurt and has that ability to kill. Then people start maybe finding joy or a thrill in that sort of thing. And it was also good that you brought up the point, Dahmer, if you looked up some of the history and like I said, some of the more some of the more intricate facts of the series, and it's almost like the producer took some creative rights to make it good for TV, because I think in reality, like some of the stuff wasn't maybe as exciting as they made it in the movie. Like they purposely put that woman who he offered the human sandwich. He purposely put her like right down the hallway in the same apartment building. And upon further investigation, I discovered that that woman was actually an amalgamation of two different women. And the main woman, which he portrayed, that woman was portrayed to be, did not live directly to where she could hear the killings through the vents of the walls. I think that was the producer, like throwing a little bit of Hollywood in there to make it a little bit more interesting. I think she lived with across the street or something, or within the neighborhood, but she
Yeah,
didn't
no, that's
live right down
100%
the
true.
hall.
You know,
Yeah,
and I guess that was one of my criticisms of it, because if you get more into the story, that woman that he gave the sandwich to, that was his neighbor, which is factual, that in itself is a fascinating story, because like this lady, like they developed a friendship.
yeah,
So it wasn't this, as they show in the TV series, it wasn't this negative, like fearful relationship. She was at the point where she was trying to actually set Dahmer up with one of her friends, because she felt bad for Jeff, and that she felt like she could help him out, and that he needed somebody in his life.
yeah,
And
yeah.
he even tried to reach out to her. They were he considered her such a good friend. He tried to reach out to her once he had been, put in prison, and they stayed in touch for a little bit, but then she had said in later interviews she couldn't keep that relationship anymore. So
Yeah.
it was a really interesting relationship that I thought they could have explored more, but it probably would have been hard to juggle, plot wise, the one woman that was the one who saw him out on the streets versus the woman that was next door. It was almost two separate plot
Yeah, because
lines.
maybe maybe in the essence of what you were saying as far as it goes is like making it a little bit more streamlined and not confusing people and having to say, oh, this person was one narrative we have to follow. Now we have to take another person and make it another narrative. Now we have two different narratives. So that's one more thing this producer has to juggle. And instead of just taking these a couple people and just throwing them into one and saying like, oh, what if it was just, because whatever he did was kind of trying to true to form, But so as far as this other person, maybe it'll just make it easier for the audience to digest, so to speak, if we just wrap it all up into one. So I get it, and it's like. It's like any other producer taking a story, like I think I gave with some other one of my podcasts, like The Lord of the Rings. Like you take a book like that and you turn it into a movie, and you're going to have a 15-hour movie. So sometimes you got to start changing, tweaking some things to kind of make it a little bit more, user friendly for TV.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So that's where you get, is it worth the mess? But I thought they did a solid enough job, but there's definitely
Yeah.
more to explore. The father, in fact, Jeffrey Dahmer's father, I don't know if he won the suit or not, but he ended up suing Netflix
Oh,
for,
wow.
yeah, for producing the film. He was, if you ever seen the father in interviews, I mean, I don't want to go too down this road so we can get into the book, but I mean, the
Yeah.
whole Dahmer story, his father, really interesting and very sad in some ways, but the father has
Yeah.
tried to make amends with the family members as best he could that were affected by his son. And I think he genuinely really did feel bad and wanted to do right by them. And he felt that first it was the portrayal. That's another thing that's debatable. The portrayal of the father and his relationship with Jeff in the show also is debatable. In fact, that put this story to rest. Let the victims
Yeah.
have peace, and we keep on revisiting this and sensationalizing it. So it was all part of that he was suing them for. So I don't know how it all played out.
Okay. Oh, wow. I'm gonna have to look into that more to see what was going on, So, um, but yeah, I guess at some level I mean, there's some good points to that, just some good moral points, because we can take somebody else's tragedy at any point and try and sensationalize it if we want to make a buck, and I guess the talk of, like I said, not to get too far into anything else, the talk of morality comes up as far as what has been going on with this resurgence in these different Netflix series and shows about killers. So, getting into the topic at hand today is the book that you had put me onto, and it is called Program to Kill, and it is by it's Program to Kill, and then the sub section would be the politics of serial murder, and that would be the book by David McGowan. Unfortunately, we attempted to get Mr. McGowan here to do this podcast live with us so we can interview him. And unfortunately, from my research, from what I read, he has passed away, I believe in 2015, sadly. So we were not able to get him, or we even not able to reach out to him. So, but very interesting book that covers a lot of ground, and we're going to try to streamline this as much as we can just for time, because I feel like if we get into the many killers that this book talked about, and maybe some of the reasons why they killed, um, it would be just far too much information to cover in one episode of a podcast. So if you're interested in the podcast, you could check the book out, maybe more of his books. But like I said, we're going to get into like maybe some of the different topics that the book discussed, of all the famous serial killers known, and many cases of strangeness and killing and molestations and such that are unknown. So the book kind of starts off, and I guess I'm not going to say appropriately, but I'm going to say maybe it starts off talking about child molestation and child killers, maybe because that would be a place to start. Because, you know, I mean, if you really think about it, like all killers are bad. And serial killers, a lot of the stuff they do with torture and is even worse. But especially as far as society goes, and as far as how we view the severity of what could be done to a person, once you start preying on children, um, it really kind of makes you like at the top of the list, of the bottom of the barrel type of person. And I mean, you could see where I'm coming from, obviously, even if you weren't a teacher, but especially because you are a teacher, and you have to deal with kids all the time, you've probably had to process at some level when you hear about these acts of school violence and school shootings and such like that, like what is it about people and their need to want to have to hurt children, what is the, are they easy victims, or do they represent society as a whole and the next generation of society? And maybe that's why some of these bad people want to prey on children, because they look at it for their easy way to be able to take out their anger for things that the previous generation did to them on to the next generation, who cannot defend themselves, and maybe a way to try to pay these people back for what they feel the wrongs were done to them. I can't get inside the head of people who molest children and hurt children, but you think there's maybe some truth to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's all of that going on. I mean, when you think about, pedophiles in general, they've already proven that there's definitely they have different brains. It's a biological, which is crazy to think about, but they're born that way. Most
Okay.
pedophiles,
Yeah.
they biologically are already, kind of focused on having attraction to children. So that already begins things off in a very treacherous way. And, what's going to happen with this individual, how they're going to live with that sort of desire in spite of, being clearly, one of the biggest taboos in our society. So that's an
Yeah.
interesting
Yeah.
topic all in itself. But I think if you take a step back, even before chapter one, chapter one, I think is called the pedocracy or something, implying that we're in a society. Opening chapter does, I think, is really interesting, is it opened my eyes to like, oh my God, like this is way bigger than I really given it any credence to. I mean, I knew there was child trafficking. I knew that there were these pedophiles out there, but to the degree and the amount of big name stories that have happened, these massive stories that have had implications at like up to the highest levels of our society. I would have
Yeah.
put that in the bucket of like just pure conspiracy theory type stuff. And
Yeah.
he gives a good, even though his ultimate theory is a conspiracy theory, if you want to call it, but the stories he tells us in that first chapter are all fact-based instances. But I think it's important, before we even go into those stories, if you go into the introduction, he starts the book out in the intro talking about brainwashing and mind control, which kind of seems
Yeah.
like, he doesn't do a great job of really laying out his thesis, which leaves the reader, I feel like, a little bit confused. Like you're kind of trying to piece what's the main point of this freaking book altogether, like it
Yeah.
doesn't seem
Yeah.
clear. So you
I
have to kind of,
agree.
he doesn't give you that until, I want to almost say, like, I have it literally jot down here, where he finally like talks about what's the whole point of this whole thing that he's talking about with the pedophile rings. So he says on page 307, the ultimate goal, and one that we are rapidly approaching, is the destruction of all social bonds and the obliteration of any remaining sense of community, the complete atomization of society. What we are now experiencing is the importation of the dreaded Operation Phoenix program into the United States. Through various created and manipulated acts of violence, the only solution to chaos, anarchy, and senseless violent acts will be a police state. We expect the planned terrorization of the U.S. population to escalate rapidly. Behind what he's arguing is that these serial killers, these different cults that he says are using these children and into pedophile rings, I think he's arguing that this is something that's coming from the top down. It's something that's probably being orchestrated by CIA, FBI, who have decades and decades of mind control brainwashing operations going back to the 1940s and 50s. They found a way to who do you target and how do you target them to get them to do what you want, and that using these people to become serial killers or mass killers creates a sense of fear and chaos in a society that makes it easier for those in power to use that fear that we have to control us. Because if we begin to disintegrate as a community, trusting each other, feeling safe amongst each other, in a constant state of fear, then big government has an opportunity to kind of step in and say, well, I'll be the one to guide you. And we're much more easier to just hand that authority over that used to be our freedom. So I think that's his overarching argument. And then he doesn't lay it out well. It's terrible how he lays it out. I hate to say it, but it's a fascinating argument, and that's where it gets interesting. So I don't understand why he didn't just lay that out in the opening and then say, here's how I put this together. And then it makes me out that way. Like, he didn't do a great job in terms of editing and putting it together in terms of that. But if you have a good sense of what the purpose behind the book is, then more of it makes sense as you read it.
Yeah, I'm going to have to 100% agree with you. I felt like the whole way through the book, we'll kind of get into some cases and like some of I see the principle behind the overarching theory of the book, and it's good that you laid it out like that. And it certainly was confusing because I felt like the book, it didn't really have any clear theme, and I think that's a strong point in this book, which was I think you could potentially lose a lot of readers in a fashion like that. It's almost like if you're telling a story and you start the story off by going on all sorts of meandering, side stories, and you're not really getting at your main point. And especially, I guess maybe even now, like that sort of thinking bothers me a little bit more because just my experience with police work. And I know one of our, like, it's almost like a pet peeve in the world of police, and I had to actually get, because I had to hear it enough when I was doing reports, when I first started doing police reports. I was constantly getting critiqued by my supervisors about like get your point, get to your point, like who, what, where, why, when, like all this extra information. I don't need it. It's just confusing, So sometimes it's better, just if you had only 2 minutes to tell a story, and you didn't have 20 minutes or 2 hours to tell a story, to just at least get to your point quickly, so at least you could start guiding the listener through why we're getting here. Like, all right, on this day, this event happened. This is what I
Right.
observed, and this is why, as opposed to like, this person woke up today and they called Sally, and Sally called Johnny, and Johnny wanted to go to the mall, and once they got to the mall, and then you might be looking at me like after about 2 or 3 minutes of that, like what, like what? Like, what exactly are we trying to get at here? So a lot of times in the world of police work, I'll even tell people that when they're really excited and they're really at that top adrenaline dump level, and they start trying to get into like telling me about a crime or an event that happened. I go, let's first off, let's take a deep breath, let's slow it down, and I want you to just focus on why we're here right now, not the whole entire backstory about what happened yesterday and last week and 3 days ago, but like right now, we're here right now. We got called here. What are we doing here right now? There's a reason. So just try to just when you give it to me, try to stick to you're standing here and there's a cut on your lip. Why is that cut on your lip? Tell me how that got there, when that started, that event, So like it's a little bit easier to kind of just break down like why exactly we're here and what we're doing. In this book, like you said, it took you on this long meandering course of like what, here, why, how, and it kind of touched on these subjects throughout that area. But up until like you said, not until the end when it started talking about like the death squads, the CIA trained death squads, and Operation Phoenix, and what was it, the psychological warfare in Southeast Asia and Central America, kind of going back towards that part of the book, around that section of the book you had been talking about, and before, let's just um, warning advisory for the listeners. Some of the topics here, obviously, we're talking about serial killers. I don't want anybody to get upset. So we are going to be talking about some things that were in the book that are kind of hard to process, maybe for some people. So just that's a user advisory. So, if you get upset about stuff like this, then, you could just consider listening to the rest. But, right here, they were talking about Noam Chomsky describing a scene, and that was right before the section of that book because I was able to pull up that section you were talking about on the PDF version of the book I have up here. And he talks about a scene where a U.S. trained Salvadorian National Guard, there was a death scene staged, and it wasn't staged in the sense that it was faked. I guess U.S. trained death squads, this is the sort of level that U.S. trained death squads would go to put the fear into society of like, hey, we are a group not to be messed with, and you will remember this, and you will go tell your friends and your family, and this will reverberate for generations what we're about to do. And this is the level of fear that we're going to put into society. A peasant woman returned home to find, and this is quoted from the book, a peasant woman, was it page 330 of the book? A peasant woman returned home to find, quote, find her three children, her mother, and sister sitting around a table, each with its own decapitated head placed carefully on the table in front of the body, the hands arranged on top, as if each body was stroking its own head. Finding it hard, baby's decapitated head and nailed its hands onto its head. A large plastic bowl was filled with blood, was tastefully displayed in the center of the table. I mean, that is absolutely horrifying. You can imagine being a mother and coming home to find your family in that fashion. That is just, I mean, that is almost beyond the scope of even what um, producers put in movies. Like if you
Oh,
think about how disturbing that would be, you
yeah,
know?
it's chilling. Absolutely, it's just. But and
Yeah.
it's text it's textbook terrorism. How do you
Yeah.
get if you're a terrorist? How do you get your point across? Well, you create the most shocking, fearful scenario that from doing that will then ripple out to society not to mess with you, not to go against your way of things. And
Yeah.
these are tactics that totalitarian governments, terrorist organizations have been doing since the beginning of time. Like how do you get, if you want to conquer and control, how do you do it? And there's nothing more powerful than getting people scared to the point where they either don't want to do anything to upset that power or they're scared that they need that power to keep their safety, one or the other. And
Yes.
there's nothing more powerful, I think, in our human society that gets people under control and following a top-down leadership.
Yeah. So
So
this is something.
that's what they're talking. So in that example, they're talking about tactics that these Salvadorian government officials were using to get the people and the peasants under their control.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, absolutely horrifying. And like I said, I almost feel like even in these horror movies we see that Hollywood puts forward all these I mean, I'm not a huge horror movie person, but I saw the one about the it was almost like the male version or like a female version of the Exorcist, where there was like a nun um, who was, I forget, it was popular within the past year, but you know, it was supposed to be like a newer version of The Exorcist, like even all these crazy, horrifying movies where they have this CGI and people turning into strange demon animals that crawl up walls. You know, we don't really see scenes like that. They're like, that would be even super disturbing to see in a movie like that. Maybe it would be deemed too disturbing. You know, maybe it would be just seemed like, we don't want to put something that disturbing inside of a horror movie because then people would really have trouble sleeping. You know, headless babies and stuff like that. Like that's pretty damn bad, man. You know, so like you said, to kind of just to kind of circle back around to the beginning, um, we have a the author starts off with talking about like these different pedophile rings, and this was a shock to me also. He starts talking about Marc Dutroux, who was a child rapist, a sadistic torturer from Belgium. He was convicted in 1989. He had missing girls that were held in his basement. Arrested in 1996 in August, and that was when the substance of his crimes had emerged. And there was an informant that was saying he was getting $3,000 to $5,000 to kidnap his girls, the kids, you know, or girls, and there was accomplices that were also caught with Mark, a man named Jean Nihul, who claimed that high levels of the government were involved. And this included orgies at the Belgian chateau, attended by government officials, a European commissioner, a number of law enforcement. And I guess when the people found out about this, I never knew about this. 350,000 citizens of Belgium took to the streets and dressed all in white, basically to
Oh
protest
yeah,
the
the
Belgian
entire
government.
country
Like how,
shut down. The
wow,
entire that's how the entire country shut down. Everybody
yeah,
didn't. Businesses were closed. Even like police departments and I want to say fire departments shut down. The fire departments of the city actually, as a symbolic gesture, drove their trucks to the front of where I guess their parliament is and started to shoot it with hoses of water to
wow,
show that they needed to
wow,
be cleansed or cleaned. That's how dirty they felt the government was and their complicity in this whole thing. So I mean, this was massive. I mean, this shook an entire
yeah,
country right
yeah,
to its core. I mean, that's where it really blows your mind. It's like this wasn't just a few people saying, "Oh, this is a conspiracy theory that some people thought the government was involved in." You know, you always got a
yeah,
couple of loons telling a story about this. You had the
yeah,
entire country on the same page as
yeah.
believing this was a, a government level cover up and conspiracy that this guy Dutroux was only a piece in a much larger pedophile ring that was going right up to the top of powerful government officials and so on him. I was watching an interview funny last night as I was preparing for this. I went on YouTube. There was a documentary on Dutroux and the whole story. And one of the investigators that were involved in looking into what government officials and powerful people that they were basically following up on what Dutroux and the other gentleman said about them just being part of a bigger thing. So they were looking into some of these
Yeah.
possibilities, and they had caught the investigators having dinner with some of the victims' parents, some of the victims' parents.
Hmm.
And so within a day after that came out in the public, they said, well, that was a conflict of interest, and they shut the entire investigation down
Oh,
as they were
wow.
making their way deeper into the possibilities of who was involved in the government.
Yeah, yeah.
That was like a day or two later after they shut the investigation down when the huge protests broke out around the country, because now everybody was like, all right, we thought it might be a cover up. Now we know it's a cover up that you're shutting the investigation down over
So,
such a minor, thing. So yeah,
yeah. I mean, so what? So we're talking
it's
about
a crazy
the
story.
the
We're
inve
talking 1996 here.
yeah, yeah. The investigators were actually speaking with some of the victims' parents, and is that, or was it the people who were being accused of the perpetration? So it was the investigators, and they felt like that was tainting the investigation. Yeah, I'm not sure. Like, I'm not sure the logic. I mean,
Right.
obviously they shut
So,
it down, but like, yeah, what's the
technically
logic?
it
Almost
would be like
like
the logic of,
courting,
let's
like courting.
say,
They, oh,
or like what?
Oh, yeah, I think your phone cut out for a second. All right. So I was basically almost saying, almost like it would be like almost like they were courting the parents, almost like what are they? Why are they taking them out to dinner? Why are they trying to grease the palms? What are they trying to smooth over? Like
Right,
what? Like what's the? Yeah, like that. Like that would be the question, right? You know, it would be
right,
like up in the air. Like what's the motive of you taking these parents out for dinner? Like whining
right,
and dining
right.
them almost.
That was the argument they were trying to make. That they were right. So I mean, it was silly because there's really no logic behind that. Why? What would the parents be giving the investigators? Maybe some sort of incentive to find out. But I mean, it was minute to say the least to shut down an entire investigation and close it up into something
Yeah.
that was about investigating into corruption in government. If
Yeah.
anything, replace the investigators, right? Like, okay, you guys did the wrong thing. We're going to just replace you with some new guys to investigate
Fair
this. But
enough.
to shut the entire thing down, it came across you were just hoping and looking for something to shut this down.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Like this was going to get shut down, and it was only a matter of time until we found a good reason to do it, and they found a good reason to do it, or at least to them it made sense. It was a reason to do it until the people of the country said no, no, and that was on October 20th, 1996, when the people took to the streets to protest, and the authorities did not want to look further into it because of certain members of their own, would be implicated. So, almost like like who's doing the investigation, almost like a Watergate type of thing where there's people, on the inside that are, like who's the bad guy, who's the good guy, who's the like who's pulling the strings, when you shut something like that down.
Right, right. Well, even
So,
before that, exactly. And the reason people were so at that point, you might remember that they were so at their point of feeling they were no longer trusting the government is because all the evidence was coming out even before the investigation started that numerous people had already warned authorities about Dutroux. People
okay.
like there was literally a guy living in Dutroux's. Dutroux owned a building, I think, and he was renting it out to somebody. And the guy that he was renting it out to, he tried to get involved in helping him abduct a girl. The guy was like,
Oh,
"I want nothing to
jeez.
do with this. You're crazy." He went straight to the authorities after Dutroux had mentioned that to him, and so the authorities. And this was just one of a number of different instances where people came and was like, "This guy's abducting girls. He's got girls in his basement," and time and
Yeah.
again, the authorities did not arrest him and
Yeah.
went the other way. There was another story where one of the investigators in the story, one of the investigators went to Dutroux's house. They found the basement and the stairwell that went down to the basement where he was locking these poor girls up. And he went down there with a locksmith. Now the locksmith was, had to be there to help him open up the door to get down to this chamber that he had set up in his
Yeah. Yeah.
home. And under, under questioning, the locksmith had said, I had literally heard the voices of little girls in the basement. And I said to the investigator, we can, like, right next to him, you hear those voices. There's girls down here. And he
Yeah.
said, the investigator said, I don't know what you're talking about, brushed him off. And then he said, all right, we didn't find anything. Let's head back. And the
Yeah.
locksmith was like, no, I'm not going anywhere. He's like, there's girls trapped down here. We need to find these kids. And the investigator pretty much like jumped rank on him and was like, I'm the one doing the investigation. I don't hear anything. Get the hell back upstairs.
Oh,
And they went
that's
back upstairs,
strange,
locked the
man.
door, left Dutroux's home. The investigator claimed they found nothing.
Oh, wow. That is
So
strange, man.
there's were numerous instances of people under under questioning who had said there were so many instances where Dutroux should have been caught and he wasn't. Why? Why did they keep looking
Yeah.
the other way? Why did they keep not following through?
That's
And
horrible.
that goes further to the people I think of Belgium being like, you guys knew about this, you were covering it up. There were people in power that were involved in this that you didn't want us to find this story out. So it's definitely one of those unbelievable stories that, curiously enough, not many people know about. Although it
Yeah, this
wasn't that
this was
long ago,
actually
and how often you hear an entire country shuts down over a criminal trial.
yeah. So, um on the positive side of this horrible, horrible story. So it turns out that Mark Dutroux, on a positive note of this, it turns out that Mark Dutroux, or Dutroux, if there is any positive to take away from the fact that he at least was convicted of murdering 4+ people and raping and 11+ more, and these were children, that he was sentenced to the max I think they could give him, in Belgium, which I have the death penalty there, because that would be in countries where they have that. That would certainly be considered for such a terrible thing that he did. So, at least the man was caught and eventually convicted. Unfortunately, it took the whole country to shut down in order to make that happen, which is horrible, and it has to make people rethink when you have these movies. Unfortunately, did you get a chance to watch The Sound of Freedom?
I haven't. I looked for it and I couldn't find it. I don't know if they took it off or something.
Really?
I
Wow.
was telling
That is
yeah.
strange.
I mean,
That is strange right there. Yeah.
I'll look again,
Huh.
but I remember putting it
Let
in.
me.
I couldn't find the film that you were
Yeah.
talking about. I remember hearing so much about it, and it wasn't coming up in my search.
Yeah. Available. Let's see. Where can I watch The Sound of Freedom? I just Googled it right now. Freedom in theaters or streaming at home on Angel Studios. I don't even know what that is. I'm gonna have to look this up at another point. Yeah, Apple TV. Sound of Freedom, based on a credible true story. Is it available on Apple TV? Let me just see. Search. Sign in. It looks like it might be. Watch on Apple TV. Okay. So there's a possibility that just for the sake of the whatever production company, and it looks like a lot of people. I know this got a lot of critiques. Like they were saying, like they were what was that, like QAnon, or what was that extreme right group they were trying to associate this with? I don't want to get too much into that because I didn't see the movie either. But I think the answer to your question is I think it's available. They've signed a contract with certain streaming platforms, and a lot of times if something's on like Apple TV, you have to be a subscriber to specifically Apple TV. You can't be Netflix, you
Right,
can't be on
right.
Hulu. You're not going to be able to find it. Yeah, like if you pay the subscription and like that kind of like I get it because however they're getting paid, however they have their rights, it's a matter of the producers and how they want to release their stories and their information. They sign a contract with a certain production company and they say, hey, you make it exclusive on Apple TV, so this is going to be a popular movie, and we're going to it's going to on our end, it's going to incentivize people to sign up to our
Yeah,
platform
they all
streaming
do it.
network in order to
They all
have to
do it. I
watch shows.
mean, that's
Yeah,
why
exactly.
it seems like such a great idea to stream things, but now it's getting worse because at least with cable, you just had
yes,
one-stop shop and you got everything you wanted. Now you want to watch
yeah,
everything you
yeah,
want, you got to keep buying these different apps. And before you know it, you're paying more than you were paying for
yes,
cable.
yes. And that is annoying, and I feel the same way. And a lot of times a movie will come out and they'll be like, it's on Apple TV. And I'm like, well, I'm not an Apple TV subscriber. And they're like, well, you have to subscribe. So I'm like, so I'm going to subscribe just to watch the movie, and then I'm going to cancel. Then they're going to like make it difficult for me to cancel. I'm going to have to get on the phone. I'm going to have to spend an hour. And they know that, at some level that it's annoying. You're going to sign up, and there's going to be X percentage of people who sign up that don't cancel. And now all of a sudden they have new subscribers. I didn't even want to be there. So like, yeah. I'd like to watch that, but I don't know if I'm gonna wait until someday it's not only on Apple TV or what the deal is. But I would like to see that movie. That was one of the movies that talking about this book I wanted to see. But anyhow, you know, that was there. There's been a big resurgence of people putting a spotlight on then just everything going on. There's been a lot of talk, and it's hard to separate the wheat from the chaff. You just hear a lot of stuff, and next thing you know, they're talking about people with robes sacrificing children here in the United States, and they're trying to implicate the highest members of all. So it's like, where's the line between fact
Well,
and
right.
fiction?
It's a
So it's
rabbit
good
hole.
to.
There's no doubt about it. It's a rabbit hole because I think it is involved in some of these rings, whether it be pedophilia rings or child trafficking. It is connected with people at high levels of power, and whenever that's the case, I mean, they have the money, the power to make things disappear. So it's like, the
Okay.
trail ends somewhere. Then you're left with, and I think that's kind of where this book goes. This book is taking a lot of loose ends that are factually based that never were resolved, and he's trying to tie them up, but bring a whole
Yeah.
bunch of them together into one knot. And
Yes.
That's where I give him credit. I think it's fascinating that he's touching on all these open things, but it's just there's a big leap of faith that you got to take in a lot of these instances because you hit dead ends. You know,
Yes. Yes.
Dutroux, I think whatever it is, Dutroux. I think Dutroux is an
Yeah.
example of that.
Yeah.
It's a dead end.
True.
I
That's
mean,
correct.
all implications point to a government
Yeah.
cover-up, point to higher level people that were involved in this. You have all types of evidence showing that, and yet, as soon as some type of
Yeah.
investigation begins on it, it gets shut down, and life goes on. You know, and that's where he
Yeah.
tries to take over, and he's trying to say, "Hey, look, well, if you look at this, this is a pattern. You see it in the U.S. with Jerry
Yes.
Epstein, for
Yes.
example. You know, all of a sudden, all things were pointing that he was involved with people at the highest levels of power. He was involved with people who were politicians and people who, you know, were put on trial to reveal that information. Dead end. He gets killed. I mean,
Yeah.
the pattern is over and over and over again with these sorts of scenarios where you know there's all of a sudden a Pandora's box is about to be opened and then they shut it. So where do you
Yeah.
go as someone who's fat who wants to know the answers? Well, you're left with a guy like David McGowan who's like, well, I'm going to attempt to tie it all together and better. I feel
Yeah.
like in some ways, even though I don't think he completely solves the whatever's going on here, I think he at least brings up enough facts and shows enough patterns that certainly leaves you thinking a little bit more about like, yeah, this is not some wacko conspiracy. There's some things here where we have some serious cover up.
Some points. Yes, yes, that there definitely is some points, and in a little bit, I'm just gonna get into a little bit of the stuff that is what I appreciated about the book is that it's just rife with good facts about certain crimes and stuff maybe you've never
Yeah.
known before, but it's also there's some areas where these leaps of faith, like as far as being like the way I think and being a little bit more like having some years on now in law enforcement, the way that I'm thinking, it's also like a little bit too much of a leap of faith because sometimes it's good to tie stuff together, but sometimes if we make too much of a leap of faith to tie stuff together, we could start like shaming the victims, and we could start, kind of letting that taint what might just be us serial killers instead of necessarily having to implicate them in some sort of a ring. It's always good if there's evidence, like you said, like that, like an Epstein case or something like that, where you have substantial evidence. There may be some of these unknown unsolves are just they they just what they are. They're just not enough information to either come up, or there is, and what we have down is what it is. So just trying to go, just finish up the whole thing about the beginning part of the book. Just some maybe facts here. There's been multiple newspapers, including The Guardian, UK's Independent, talking about a massive pedophile ring of over 5,000 people in November of 2000. Horrified investigators found images of over 2,000 children who were being raped, killed. 1,500 people in high places were being implicated. New York Times ran a story in 1997, and this is all information taken from the book. I'm kind of just skate through some of it, and then if you want to add anything after, you can kind of just throw it in there. 1997, New York Times stated there was a growing indignation in France about reports of kidnapping, rape, more than 250 people confiscated. Some were implicated and confiscated from them was more than 5,000 video cassettes of these occurrences. 1999. Two unnamed men, according to the BBC, were on trial for a pornography ring in Germany, Poland, and Czech Republic involving sexual abuse of children ages 3 to 14 since 1993. One of the names of, and this is according to a 1998 article from BBC, Wonderland, the Wonderland Club. And actually, this is I'm not going to say a fun fact because normally, if I was talking about a lighter subject, I would say that. This is a disturbing fact. I don't know. Eric Franklin Rosser, who was a former keyboardist from John Mellencamp, I don't know if you remember
Yeah.
reading this, was was being in a club called Teen Boys, which is a subset of Wonderland. So, you know, not to, and I guess with a caveat there, I don't know, you know, I don't know. Like, I'm saying, like, I haven't done enough research on him, but this was a fact in the book. So sometimes, somebody, um, you know, I mean, theoretically, and I don't know what Teen Boys is. If Teen Boys is only young boys, or if it's a website that has, because then the age of consent would be 18 or 19 or 20. So you could have something saying like a website, stating Teen Boys. If that's only underage kids, then that's a problem clearly. But I don't know what level of implication this man was into this ring and how deep it went. So sometimes somebody might have searched something on the internet at one point and then they get arrested, and then it's like from then till the end of time their name is shamed and they're considered like a monster. But there's a possibility. Like I said, I didn't necessarily look into the exact facts of what this guy did. So but he was being investigated at some point.
His name
So
came up, and the other name that came up, and again, he got, in the end, I think there was nothing, obviously, there was nothing that was found on him, but Pete Townsend was also a name that was
yes,
added to it,
yes.
which was like kind of shocking.
So what you just said, and I remember somebody in the book basically stated like they could have looked into Pete Townsend and at some point found that he visited a website that had like who knows, like somebody in a bathtub, somebody under 18 in a bathtub, and next thing you know, Pete Townsend's this devil, and like the guy might have not even known that this picture was on the website. Like you know what I'm saying? So there's always like a caveat when you have these investigations. Like there is a possibility that maybe at some point he visited some website or something, but like it doesn't necessarily make somebody a monster because I mean he might have done something unknowingly.
Right.
It's like
Absolutely. You got to proceed with caution. And
yeah,
the only time I think where it starts to get concerning is when you start to see a pattern. So if you told me Pete Townsend, this
yeah,
keyboardist, then Dave, let's say this guy and that guy, all 4, 5, 6 different musicians were all, names pop up. Then suddenly it's like, that's more than coincidence, like that's more than just happenstance.
yep.
Guys.
I understand.
So I don't think it was that many names that came up. So I wasn't like, oh, when I heard Pete Townsend's name, they talked about it. I took it with a grain of salt. Like, more likely than not, he was just like clicked on the wrong thing or did something and his name popped up.
Yep. Okay. I mean, I understand that. Okay. And then also, like I said, there was just so much information in here. It's hard to really we can't really focus on what's going on. There was an author, Thomas Gordon Thomas, in 1990s. Child pornography was a $3 billion a year business, which was actually more than Disney was making at the time. Tom General wrote in Esquire magazine in 2001. There is a child abuse is prevalent because the culture is besotted with the erotic promise of teenage girls, like what's young, what's new, what's alive. Maybe that's the appeal for why some of this is going on. And that kind of led me to ask the question, well, what's the push for this pro-pedophilia agenda? Because that was something that I asked, like, what is the push? If everyone's saying child pornography, pedophiles, like who's pushing and why are they pushing? And there was an article from 2000, the Institute of Advanced Study of Human Sexuality in San Francisco stated there was considerable evidence that there was no inherent harm in the sexual expression in childhood. That's just one of many, including a 1998 study from the American Psychological Journal, which argued that value-neutral terms such as adult-child sex should be used to describe willing encounters between an adult and a adult pedophile and a child. So this is just one of the co-authors, Robert Bauserman, with Maryland Department of Mental Hygiene, who has previously written for Padika. He said that the Times already used defend accused child molesters in at least one of 3 court cases. So I even feel like that's, I mean, is this something that you've been seeing in school? Like I'm not sure if they're pushing this agenda to you guys in the schools, but like there's almost this push. I think I used the word pedophile one time and someone's like, no. you cannot use the word pedophile. It's somebody who's like something challenged or something. I'm not sure what the sanitized word for that is, like a safe word, because we don't want to even shame the perpetrators anymore.
I haven't heard anything. I know what you're talking about, and I see where they're. Um, so I see why you may be changing the name because the connotation is so terrible, and I think it is terrible. So it's kind of hard not to rationalize why you would change it. But I do know what you're talking about. I think there's some people who are like, well, if you're biologically born that way and you're trying not to, it's very sick because this is the problem with those guys. They're born that way. You can't change that. Like you're not. Maybe someday they'll be able to go into their
Yeah,
DNA and whatever's going on in their brain and be able to make some adjustment. But as of now, the reason why it's so rampant,
yeah,
or at least a big part of it, is because they're born this way. Now think about someone heterosexual person born that way, and then it's like, well, you can't have sex. It's a
yeah.
drive inside of you from the day you die, and from the day you're born to the day you die. Well, not until you're born, but from the time you hit puberty until the day you die, pretty much. Like, and now you're not allowed to. Now, unless you're going to take a life. And this starts to lead you to when you go down this road, it's like, okay, they're born this way. They're trying not to act on this born innate need for children. Where a lot of these guys ended up going? Well, you want to talk about maybe the biggest pedophile ring in the history of the society? You go to the Catholic Church. And, what happened?
Yeah,
A lot of these
yeah,
guys who were pedophiles who were like, I'm sinful, I'm terrible, I can't function in society like a normal person. What do? They retreat to becoming priests a lot. Well, at one time, a bunch of them are retreating to become priests. You can hide there. You're around children, and you're under a
my
cloak of
God, yeah,
trust and power. And it became a perfect place for a lot of these types to start to sneak into. And so, if you want
yeah,
to talk about
yeah.
one of the biggest cover-ups in history at the highest levels, you go right to the cover-up of the Catholic Church and of the priests that were molesting boys for generations. So
And how many people must have turned a blind eye to that just because it was like this is the word of God, like
at
it's
the
like,
highest levels.
how dare you even thinking about accusing someone a man of the cloth to do something so horrible. Okay, so yeah, I just quickly, I don't want to get too much into that, but there was a university professor who suggested that we call pedophiles quote unquote minor attracted persons. And apparently he agreed to resign after that because there was an uproar. But it was suggested at a university that we stop calling pedophiles and refer to them as like a sanitized word of minor attracted persons. Like we should stop shaming them effectively. But apparently there was a lot of backlash when people heard this because people just don't have any stomach for, people preying on our children for the most part, which is good. I think society, should stand up. I think some of this cancel culture is just a little much, without getting too much
Well,
into
yeah,
politics
I
because
mean,
I'd
go back
rather
to the book.
not. But it
He
came
talks
up.
about this in the book. If you go to, I think it's chapter 7, Sympathy for the Devil is what it's called. He goes into this movement
Yeah,
in American society. I think it's chapter 7, but there's a chapter that he goes into at levels of academics and in medicine who are promoting and arguing that, sexual relations with children, as young as 14 is not unnatural, that there's no proof or evidence that
yeah,
having sexual relations with children that young is a bad thing for them. I mean, these aren't just like yahoos. Well, they are yahoos, but these aren't just like, just anybody off the street. These are people who are in the academic world. Some of these people are, you know, psychiatrists. And so there is a movement in American culture, maybe around the world, that is pushing for younger children to be able to be sexualized and engaged with. And as
yeah,
scary as that sounds, there he talks about this, why they're trying to legitimize the sexuality of children. And so, that's totally
yeah.
in the
My
book.
God. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Not a good thing. Okay, so just to maybe just kind of touch on a couple more things about child sexual because there was quite a bit that it covered, the book covered, and all sorts of different cases. A single trafficked child could be earn the trafficker up to $30,000 according to statistics from a book written back in 2004. Um, there was a case in the United States of a man named Greg Spence, who was a Republican power broker, who stated that parties in Capitol Hill would have young, and these were people on the guest list were up as high as former CIA Director William Casey and former Deputy Intelligence Ray Klein. So that's to give a little bit more meat to the story that this could be happening here in the United States. And we had touched on the Phoenix program. These mind control programs, and this was also part of the CIA assassination squads and death squads. Up to some 20,000 lives have been claimed with these. So to kind of factor that back into what we were saying about what the government has some say in some of these people dying, and how that could be filtering down into society and affecting us in a negative way, to where people are, kidnapping people, children, killing people and children, and the fear that that puts onto society. Let's see. Um, there was a case of Michael Aquino, who abused his children and wife, and he was actually operating a child development center in it looks like it was in San Francisco, run by the U.S. Army. And then this has implications into the government, that this man was running this, and it was ran by the U.S. Army. A 3-year-old boy had been anally raped there. Um, and then the place was burned down during the investigation. There was another man, Gary Hambright, who was arrested on child abuse, and they're trying to draw some links to some of these cases. There was a child abuse in West Point. The Herald Times, 1991, report of satanic acts and animal sacrifices. So at some point, a lot of these cases, it seems like McGowan tries to factor in satanic praise and like cults and cult activity. And I think there's some um, facts to back this up. When we get into this seems like, I think a lot of people didn't know this, but this was one of the most shocking ones to me out of the whole book. Actually, out of the entire book, one of the most shocking cases was the McMartin preschool incident, and I think that happened down in Texas, I believe, in what was that, like the late '80s or early '90s, and I believe that's when it happened, and that was where 350 students were disclosing sexual behaviors, and all these kids were talking about how they were being molested, and satanic behavior was what was going on. They were being taken out of this school and brought to people's homes and photographed and sexually molested. They were stating there were tunnels under the school.
Oh, I think you're referring to the McGovern. I think it was called the.
Oh, it's called McGovern.
Let's
go. Let me
it was
double
out
check
in
that.
California, I thought, but maybe
abuse. McMartin, was it?
McMartin, maybe that was it.
Yeah, sexual abuse in the 1980s, and that was
the McMartin preschool, and that was
Los Angeles. Yep, and Manhattan Beach, California. There we go.
Was a major
That's
case.
correct.
Yeah, to this day they haven't resolved that.
My God,
that's still highly disputed.
Yeah,
there's still children who are adults today who said they went to that school and still stand by their stories of what happened with all the, even though everyone got off on it, and it was. There are still children, like I said, they were adults today, still stand by their stories. There's, they said that they found tunnels underneath it. When they found the tunnels, they found a few artifacts that would have pointed to some sort of satanic related activity down in those tunnels. So that's a very controversial story, because there's people that argue that the whole thing was a hoax, and that it was just kind of embedded in the minds of children by the psychiatrists that were working with the children. But the fact that the stories were so consistent, and that the children, one after another, were
Yeah.
talking about things that had to do with sexual activity and things that had to do with very details about like what was going on in these tunnels that were related to some sort of ceremony. It was very far. It was hard to believe that they could know all of that and be able to say that consistently amongst them, and yet it was all just
Yeah.
a big hoax, And these kids were just
How could yeah, exactly. How could so many children? How could 460? And I think there were some side schools around there that were also implicated. It wasn't just that school. There was a let me see if I wrote that down. But there was yeah, there was a couple other schools that were get 450 kids or 350 to 460 students to basically all get on the same page about lying about the same things. And, I know there was some blowback because I didn't bring up the tunnels during the trial. They said they didn't exist. Then they actually got Gary E. Stickle, and he was a archaeologist that actually George Lucas used, for factual information during the filming of the Indiana Jones movies, and he's the one that led the excavation of these tunnels. So there was a blowback from the skeptics saying it was just a trash pit for maybe an old house that was built in the area beforehand, and then there were other people saying no, this was consistent with what the children were talking about. So, there definitely was, you get that many people all on the same page talking about the same things, The children could clearly explain what human viscera looked like and smelled like. It was very strange and an absolute horrible case, but then the author starts getting into different serial killers, moving on to like adult serial killers and maybe like their history with this very similar narrative. They don't know who their parents are. Or there was abuse as children. This is something that's commonly known in the world of people that are thought to have been serial killers. Like it's the consistent years of not having a good home structure and child abuse that leads them to start doing these horrible things. You had Henry Lee Lucas, who was one of the most prolific serial killers in the annals of American crime. He was scheduled for execution on June 30th, 1998. And one of the interesting facts that was brought up was that the governor of Texas at the time, which was George Bush, pardoned him and I think commuted his death sentence. It was kind of perplexing at the time because there was many other people on death row at the time that didn't get those pardons.
right.
But why would it be?
Wasn't
Yeah, why would it be
wasn't
this guy
former
that?
President Bush the one that did the pardon for him?
Oh, was it former President Bush? I thought it was
Oh,
George
was
Bush
it
Senior.
senior? Oh, okay.
Yes,
Well, yeah, they both were.
yes. No, 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 no. You could be right. I would have to double check. Yeah, I saw George Bush. I would have to check if it was George Bush Senior. Yeah, it was in 1998, so I guess that was right before George Bush Jr. ran for presidency. So I think he was governor of Texas at the time. So I think it would have been that who pardoned Henry. Was it Lee Lucas?
Yeah, he's an interesting story.
Texas Governor George W.
In
Bush.
fact, just
Yeah,
a side note.
1998. So I
Yeah,
think you were
kind of an
correct.
interesting side note for those people. If you ever watch America's Most Wanted, and the guy that started the show and everything based upon his son disappearing and then being found murdered, they never
Yeah,
found for sure the killer, but Henry Lee Lucas and his partner both said that they were involved in the killing of his son. And when they did, a background search on where they were in the country at the time of the murder, they were literally within that area. So, that's, you see that, see their reach.
yeah,
And
yep, yeah. It's not surprising when you hear about this that these guys might have been involved in just considering all of the unsolved crimes that we have in this country.
a couple of the more, I think one that you would really want to point out to it would be Son of Sam. And that would
Yeah,
be, I think if
was that
anyone ever gets the
Berkowitz,
chance, if
right?
you haven't seen
David
it,
Berkowitz.
really super interesting documentary called The Sons of Sam. That's on Netflix.
Okay,
And
they believe it. It was more than one killer.
it goes into and relates much to what McGowan has been talking about in this book, even though the book was written years before this ever came out. It goes into that Berkowitz was involved. He's admitted that he was involved in a much larger satanic ring. That he wasn't a lone shooter. He was involved with other people that were involved in the killings with him. Goes on and on to the connections that he was part of this larger satanic cult that was part of doing these sorts of rituals and killings, and goes back to this book. So it's an interesting connection. And, just to bring it to the military connection, if people realize that Berkowitz was a former military, that's partly where he got the name Son of Sam. He had said that, I think he was during the Korean War or the Vietnam War, and he was saying that all of them are sons of Sam, meaning like Uncle Sam. And that was part of what he got. He gave the title of his name, like he was killing for the government.
Oh, yes. All right. Yeah, you're right. And my notes here, first I was going to talk about Lucas in his own biography claims how he was to that a little bit more, like who this cult was, what the name of this cult was. But, if this is like, he claims that he took the cyanide down to Jonestown, like he was part of this, larger network of satanic cults, and at least this is a claim. You don't know if these are just people. Also, after they get caught, they just want to get themselves out of trouble, so they want to throw the heat onto someone else. But yeah, as you were saying with Berkowitz, took the heat, but maybe he was just a patsy and not a lone killer, because there was a lot of people suspecting there was multiple killers afterwards, because when they looked at Berkowitz, I guess it was either his cell or some area they found of Berkowitz. I think it was where he was living, maybe his apartment. He had telephone numbers scrolled upon his wall, like for Scientology training centers, a Montauk golf and racket club, which was an area they thought could be where military mind control was going on. So there is a possibility, there's a possibility that because of all these connections, and even per investigation, him having these ties to these different types of centers or clubs, that there could be some connection there. Or is it just a man suffering from hearing voices and some sort of breakdown? Like you said, you have these loose ends, and it's good for the author to try to tie all this up. Let's see
and that
here.
fits very well into the whole point of the mind control and why children are involved. I mean, McGowan's argument is that the reason why children aren't particularly targeted is because if you go into like the mind control programs that go back to the CIA, there's Operation MK Ultra, Operation, there's a couple of other previous ones before MK Ultra. MK Ultra is the most famous one, but Operation Artichoke.
Yeah.
These were the early brainwashing, mind control operations the CIA was doing. And what they found, because they had to release a lot of the information that had to do with MK Ultra, although there's still a lot that hasn't been released. The reason why children are ideal for mind control is because they're more psychologically vulnerable and easier to put into a state of multiple personality state. So what they realized was a lot of people who suffer from like multiple personality disorder, which is now known as dissociative identity disorder, that's like the new term for it, DID. They find that to get someone in what they call a dissociative state, any one of us have a dissociative state when, let's say, you drive to work and you park into the parking lot and you're like, holy shit, I can't believe I didn't remember that the entire drive here. I just, they said anyone who's experienced that, that's a form of a dissociative state. Your mind works on autopilot, but your sense of identity and self is gone. They're saying that's a good example of a very small state of dissociative state. People who have been traumatized at a young age, in order to deal with the severe trauma that they're in front of, normally a human being's mind works like fight or flight, right? If you're in a state of danger, you either flee or you fight to survive to get out of it. But if you're a child, you can't do dissociative state. So let's say you're an innocent child being, taken advantage of, tortured, hurt, your brain will kind of disassociate from the experience, disconnect in the moment, and then so you don't have to continue to relive that thought. what that creates is different personalities potentially for somebody, which creates ultimately multiple personality disorder. So going back to brainwashing and mind control, I think McGowan makes the argument that the reason why these pedophile rings tie into this whole bigger mind control serial killer thing is that someone like a Berkowitz, who had very early on childhood trauma, who early on was able to talked about having states of dissociative states as a young age, they're a perfect candidate for someone to then use them to brainwash and control, because they've already disconnected from their normal personality, and you can influence them to do certain actions that they're not going to be conscious of if a different identity or personality takes over when they do those killings. So the fact that Berkowitz heard voices, the fact that Berkowitz talks about his childhood trauma, the dissociative states he dealt with, the fact that he was in the military, all tie into, I think, one of the big arguments that McGowan's making, that a lot of these serial killers fit the profile of somebody who would have been an ideal candidate that MK Ultra and other CIA sorts of mind control operations would have targeted to do their bidding.
Yes. Which makes somebody pliable. The abuse and all that makes them, having that split type of personality, allows someone to be like a Manchurian candidate, and a lot of people. I didn't see much about this in the book. I think it touched upon this, but the senator. Let's see, what was his name? I remember
Oswald?
his name. No, it wasn't Oswald. It was this. He was a senator. There was another Kennedy that was assassinated
Ted
afterwards,
Kennedy?
and it was yes, I
Ted
believe.
Kennedy's the father
What was
of
the kid?
Robert Kennedy, who's running for president right now.
Yes. They were saying that the kid. What was his name? I'll get into you in a second. He was assassinated. I remember that. He was shot, right?
He was shot. Yeah.
And who was killer?
And the man that shot him, I think, is who you're trying to pull up?
Yeah, they were saying that he was a Manchurian candidate.
Yeah. People say Lee Oswald was a Manchurian candidate in some ways. He fits the profile of what McGowan is talking about, what these MK Ultra operations were doing. People who had traumatic childhoods, people who were, he had a history of mental breakdowns. He was in the military. He spent a number of years. I think Oswald was literally working off a base that has been later to be found out was doing some sort of mind control operations at the time. So
yeah. Like, he fits the profile. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
He fits the profile. Sirhan was the name. Sirhan was the name of the person that shot Senator Kennedy.
Yes.
Senator Robert Kennedy. But they were saying, like, after he shot him, he was just in a state of, like, just almost like catatonic. Like, he wasn't like, they were just like, well, we'd be able to get some logic, out of this kid, like this person for shooting, a political candidate, but they just didn't seem to get much. Almost like he didn't even know why he did it, and then like that leads people to believe, like, well, then why, So, yeah, definitely. But without going down that rabbit hole, maybe that is definitely a whole other story. But yeah, there definitely could be some. There's certainly, considering just all the strangeness going on with that whole investigation and every angle about that there was either some sort of mind control and he was a patsy. But there's like you already know, and I'm sure even how much you've looked into that's a whole different animal there, the Kennedy assassination. Getting back to some of the stuff McGovern was talking about, and just Jess, as far as time goes, I know you said you had some papers to do and stuff, because I know you teach school. Are you still good? And you figure we got another, maybe, I don't know, just looking at my notes, approximately, say, like 25-ish minutes or something like that?
If we could tie it up, we try to kind of put it into fast forward mode.
Okay. Yeah, exactly. Because I'm just looking at my notes here, and I was like, this is one of the things I struggled with this book. and one of the things I felt like was like a weak point, a strong point, and a weak point at the same time. There was so much jumping around. It was like so many narratives to follow. It got hard to be able to figure out exactly the points of each narrative to pull together and say like this connects and ends up. But as a strong point and almost as one of the weakest points, it was like trying to talk about it now. Like I'm trying to go over so much information, and like I can only give you so many names, so many victims, so
No, and
many
I don't
when
think
we
it's
literally have
worthwhile to do
dozens.
that because you
Yeah,
probably just overwhelm your audience with too many names. I think
yeah,
simplifying it and tying it
yeah,
to like a
yeah, yeah.
couple of prime examples, like Berkowitz is a great example. I would talk about maybe Charles Manson. He's another very interesting example. Had ties to the CIA,
Okay.
had ties to um, different operations. Was then using brainwashing techniques on the cult members that he was working with to do his bidding. I think that's another interesting one to choose from. I mean, I would just give a kind of an overview, and I would even say to your audience, like, this is not a type of conspiracy book to jump right into if you don't have some, it's not a good one for,
Yeah,
it's not a
yeah,
good one
yeah,
for newbies. You need some back knowledge, you need some
yeah,
feet wet,
yeah,
because it's just going to seem like splatter of
yeah,
information that makes no sense unless you have some. You need to have some background on
yeah, yeah.
the CIA operations. You need to have a little background knowledge of kind of so some suggested books I would tell people to read would be like The Legacy of Ashes is the name of one book. That's about
Okay.
it's all about the information that was finally released, I think in the 90s on CIA operations. And it won the Pulitzer Prize
Oh, okay.
back in like the early 2000s, I think. And it goes all into all the corruption, these really like bizarre different operations, like the mind control operations that the CIA was involved in. That's an interesting one. It's thick. It's a long one, but that gives you a lot of back sense to like, why would anybody think about this even being a possibility, right? Like, sounds like Yahoo, unless you have that back
Yeah,
knowledge. I would read a good book on,
yeah.
it's called The Devil's Chessboard by David Talbot. And
Yes, yes. I was
that's
looking
a
into
really
that.
good one to
I
read,
was
and
looking
you
into
learn
reading that.
about a lot about a gentleman named um, oh darn it, what's his name? He was the head of the CIA, him and his brother, and it gives you an idea of kind of how he was using the CIA to almost running like his own little personal organized crime machine. It's almost to that extent. That's thus named the Devil's
Yeah.
Chessboard. But Albert Dulles, he was the first head of the CIA, which was first the OSS back in World War II. But I would suggest anybody interested in this sort of stuff learn about who Albert Dulles is. He has a lot to do with a lot of the programs that eventually are connected to this book, the mind control programs, MK Ultra, Operation, Phoenix,
Yeah.
all of those he was involved in and had his hand in. So you got to know about him a little bit and have a
Oh,
better understanding of, what he was messing around with. And there's another one called CIA Man. It's about Charles Manson and the CIA's connection. It's called Chaos: Charles Manson, the CIA, and the Secret History of the 60s. And that's a really interesting one to give you an idea of what they were doing with LSD and experimental drugs. I'm talking about the CIA, like what they were doing and how they were using it on, they were doing it with lure in to see the effects of LSD. They thought LSD would be something that could be
yeah.
used as a way to mind control people. If you gave them a dose of it and they were in a state of vulnerability, in a sort of trip, you'd be able to influence them. So, all of that are good places to go to get some sort of grounding under your feet before you just dive into, a book like this, which is
Yeah.
not well organized to begin with, but fascinating if you can connect the dots with
Yeah.
some of.
Yes, yes. And that's that very interesting to hear about LSD originally being it was originally, from what you're saying, being used as a weapon of war almost, like a weapon of either, being able to use people to get them to do what you want them to do. So the fact that that was seriously looked into, and the fact that we also had this huge surgence of LSD in the hippie movement, and that almost became like an anti-war. So it's kind of like almost like ironic in a sense, if you want to look at it like that, that like the fact that the CIA was in there looking at LSD being used as a weapon of war, and the hippie movement was using LSD as a means to open the mind, to have peace,
Well,
love,
that's
and
interesting.
freedom and rock and roll. You know.
That's a really interesting point, which would then I would suggest people to read McGowan's other book, which I think he's more known for than this one, and it's all um, about that with the LSD use and how his argument is the CIA was
Okay.
using LSD and to stop the counter, because he goes back to the beginnings. He goes, if you go back to like the late 50s, early 60s, to the early counter Vietnam movements that were going on college campuses, they weren't hippies. They were very straight edge type of kids, or academics, but the government saw policy on the Vietnam War.
Yeah.
So what they thought was, as far as McGowan argues in his book, is that by getting LSD out to the streets, getting these young kids hooked on it, and using that would use it as a way to blunt their. So he says, if you look at the counter war movement in the early '60s, they were sharp academic kids. You fast forward 5 to 6 years, once the drugs and the rock and roll and the LSD hit the streets, they're hippies who are like
Yeah.
completely out of it, and the anti-war movement has suddenly petered out. So it was
Yeah.
his argument that that was part of their operation. Just infiltrate the youth movement, get it get it kind of drugged up and hedonistic, and get its mind off of being anti-war, anti-government, and we can kind of let them go off and play their instruments and get high, and we can take care of what we need to.
Yeah, and there's certainly a argument for that, you know. It was I mean I think there was an argument also made in the whole it was like the whole I think it more had to do with racial tension and racism going on in like the early to mid 1900s, and the jazz movement, and how heroin was big in the jazz movement, and how people like associated with music were using drugs, and that was a way to undermine the movement of which empowered a type of culture and empowered people, and but there was also, it was riddled with drug use too, and like a lot of the scene of what was going on with that, and it was that used as a tool to undermine the movement.
That's interesting. I never
So
thought about the jazz
we also,
movement, but that is very true. That was maybe your first real anti-authority youth movement in America. And do things
yeah,
your own way, think your own
I
way, and it makes sense that you point to that, because the hippies are just that whole youth movement is only an offshoot of that. So yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, and you had some famous people like Billie Holiday, died young from the just excessive drug use, and what we saw in the book too was then this other type of killers that skated into the cult activity and cartel activity and drug activity. There was like the Matamoros cult. They recovered a bunch of bodies in 1989 down in Texas, and then there was 74 homicides in Mexico City. They were responsible, or at least thought to be responsible. They skated cross lines with the Hernandez drug family. And one of these, they were saying over almost 300 bodies were found, 1 to 300 bodies were found in mass graves associated with the Hand of Death cult, which was, I think, right over the border in
Yeah,
Mexico.
yeah.
And these were almost like as powerful. Yeah, that's
And a
insane.
lot of them
Like
were
to think about.
prostitutes. A lot of them were child trafficked women or children that were trafficked for pedophilia. If you go to this one area that you're talking
Yeah.
about, they call it like I forget what the name of it is, but it's like Death Valley sort of name. And it's just like hundreds of yards of just bodies that have been dumped there by nobody. These were runaways,
Yeah.
lost children, abducted women, abducted children. And it's just a whole
Yeah.
hundreds of yards of them out in this area.
Like society almost looks at, unfortunately, people as like the disposables or the forgottens, like they can disappear, and it's, because they don't have a lot of ties to a lot of people and they're troubled, it will go unnoticed. And one of the cases that I, before this, and I took an interest to it because I had heard a whole NPR series that turned into a podcast, and maybe this is worth checking out, just as far as maybe it'll spark your interest in researching something else. It was a podcast series called The Lost Women of Juarez. And it was a, I forget how many part series of a podcast that went into, effectively there's a, I'm not going to say phenomenon because I think there is some facts behind who's doing this, but it was this unknown at the time, or like unspoken about situation in Juarez, New Mexico, which is kind of like a very working class and even like a struggling working class type of area, um, like real blue collar, where just women were just disappearing by the dozens, within a certain area. And, you see wanted, missing posters stop everywhere. Where's my daughter? Where's my family member? Where's my sister? And these young women were just missing up. And then these mass graves would turn up with these women. And I guess, like, the long and short of it, it was suspected that they were working at these certain factories, and before they would work at these factories they would have to get a picture taken and a profile taken, and like these cartels had access to this database of all of these women working at the factories in Juarez, and they would just go through these databases and select certain women that effectively, for whatever reason, for sexual reasons, they would get some sort of a big drug score, and they would want to celebrate, and they would set up an abduction of one of these women. She would just never come home from work. Oh yeah, we saw cartels, and the implication that, you know they would kidnap these women, rape them, gang rape them, and then because they knew the women would be able to implicate them, they would murder them after. So you had all these women turning up in these like these mass graves in Juarez, New
That's
Mexico, and
where
it
I
was
think I was
actually
referring to, because I do know exactly what you're talking about. I saw a little bit of a documentary on it, and that's what I was talking about, like these, yards, these hundreds of yards of football fields of dead bodies. That's in the area in Juarez
yeah,
where these mass graves were popping up with these women. And some of them were children too, I think. I think
yep,
they have also found that. And so, it goes into
and
how prevalent, like, and easy these disposable some of these people are seen by these different,
yeah,
cartels and who knows what else. But I would say then, John,
and
honestly, like, to go any further into the book, I think might overwhelm you. I think we've touched on the big ideas of the book and and kind of sprinkled
yeah,
out some of the different serial killers and just kind of connecting the dots. And hopefully that makes it a little bit easier for them, if someone is interested in reading the book, to get
yeah,
to get a better understanding of where he's going with this, so you're not so lost if you read it.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Because it was, like I said, I even felt that way. I mean, I have a little bit of a background, but I don't have like so much of a background where, I knew about these cases in depth. But it definitely looked like there was, more was the same. I just wanted to touch before we wrap it up some of the logic I was talking about. Like, there was a case. It's going to be. Let's see here. It was. I think it was the Carrie Stainer murders. And if I had to sum that up, I believe, yeah, it was there was a woman that was taken. The Carrie Stainer was a killer that admitted to killing. He was at least given life in prison for the death of one woman, but effectively in 1996, 1966, he was able. Oh yeah, it was Richard Speck in 1966. He was able to subdue 9 women. He came into a house and he subdued 9 women. I don't know if he cut up some bed sheets, but he bound and tied them, and then effectively he dragged them off one by one, and he had them all in a room together, all tied up. And he had a gun at first, so as each of them would come into this get together, he would, abduct one and tie them up, abduct one, and then eventually he had 9 women in a room, and he started dragging them off one by one out of this room and systematically killing them over the period of a course of 4.5 hours. This is like a grim, really grim story. And then he would wash up, and then he would, grab the next one, and he would just kind of he's worked his way through this group of women, killing them one by one. And one of them actually survived. Her name was Cora Amaru, and you know, like effectively the author basically stated, like, tying this into like it had to be like a group of killers. There's more than one. Like this guy couldn't have been a lone operator. Like he's basically saying, like, well, how did this guy kill 9 women? You know, like how come if they weren't all in the room together, they didn't untie each other? Well, you know, like that. Like how come Cora Amaru was the woman who was throwing the party? Why was she the only survivor? How did he miss her under the bed? You know, and it's like we can't put ourselves there, but you just imagine the brutality of this man slaughtering 8 women in a row, and the fact that maybe after slaughtering 8 women, is somebody who's a complete psychopath going through a serial, like some sort of a binge of killing people, could have missed one person in a room that tied up and hid under a bed somewhere in a dark corner of a room, and maybe
Sure,
we just
yeah.
can't we just weren't there. All yeah, and it's almost like I almost kind of felt like in a sense that he was victimizing the victim,
Right, right.
and like this woman threw a party and had to see 8 of her friends or experience losing 8 of her friends to brutal murders, and she herself was a victim who could have easily been killed, and like there's so many unknowns about that maybe a gun pointed in their face. Women who have never been had a gun pointed in their face before, tied up, were just scared. Like, oh well, why didn't they when they were all in that room together? Why didn't they untie each other? And like, if they knew it was a half hour between each killing, like in 2020, as a person who's maybe never been the victim of a horrible crime, yes, like that all seems very logical. But for 8 women or 9 women that are hogtied in a room or tied up in a room, all seriously thinking that if they make a peep, that some psychopath's going to come bursting in the door and blow their brains out, like it's it's real easy to judge in 2020 hindsight a situation like that. But I don't think we should be shaming any of the victims.
I agree. And I think that's where sometimes these conspiracy theory investigations, which we find fascinating, we have to also be careful that we're respecting the victims, we're respecting those who have suffered from it, and being open-minded to, we don't know all the answers. So yes, it's good to question, but
Yeah.
not to the point where we're undermining someone's story that at the end of the day, she's got more credibility than anybody else that was there that day. So unless there's glaring evidence she was a part of it, don't start throwing out accusations, because then you're just tarnishing someone's reputation without any right.
Yeah. And there was some other type of stuff like that where I think one of these killers they actually got a fingerprint off a typewriter from a burnt house after he was tried to burn the house down after he killed these people, and or they got it off a soda can, and he's like, well, allegedly or unplausibly they took a fingerprint off a soda can. I'm like, if it was enough to accuse this man of murder, then apparently they found a fingerprint on a soda can. And I don't think they would have just introduced that into court, like if it was just absolutely fabricated, So it's like, sometimes this is how evidence is had. It seems implausible. It seems like, hey, the man tried to burn the house down, but yet somehow there was a typewriter in the house that had a fingerprint on it. Like, like we don't really know, unless we were the police investigators on the scene. And, another like you said, another interesting thing was the Great Acid Coup of '69, and Manson, and how he was able to. There was actually a court case, and they found out that in Denmark. So this is an interesting, I would say, fact of the book. So Denmark, a man by Estabrooks, and was talking about hypnotism, and they used this in a court case in Denmark to say an amateur hypnotist named Nielsen induced a hypnotic subject named Herdrop to commit a murder. Nielsen, the hypnotist, got a life sentence, the maximum penalty in Denmark, while Herdrop, the murderer, only received a 2-year sentence. So with the whole Manson thing, like there is some foundation in other countries, like in the court system, to say that you could have control over somebody and not actually have done the murders yourself. So I think that's why that's a landmark case with the whole Manson killings, because that does show like some level of mind control that Manson had over this family that he had.
That's fascinating, and there you go. I mean, it's like, what is a cult? How do you get a bunch of freaking people, sometimes hundreds of them, to all drink Kool-Aid that's going to kill them, right? Like, that people are
Yep.
using tactics psychologically in other people that are allowing them to take control over their actions and their And I'm not excusing anybody that, who nonetheless does it. There's accountability, I think, in my opinion, for the most part, unless you were completely vulnerable, which is why the children aspect of the book is what he's talking about, which is why it's like they're so vulnerable, like there's no room for putting any onus on them. But anyway, that's a cult. I mean, that's a cult. Somebody who has effectively been able to
Yeah.
understand psychological tactics that can get people to do your bidding, follow your every whim.
Yeah.
What the CIA was trying to figure out. When you're trying to overthrow governments and competing countries and undermine revolutions that are against, that's a way simpler way of handling things than having to bring in troops and armies and militaries, right?
Very true. You can use the media, you can use culture, you can use any tools available if you could start to influence people. And we even see that today, and with this whole thing with COVID and social media, and how there has to be disclaimers now anytime anybody posts a video. I even had one of the disclaimers on one of my podcasts. They were talking about, I interviewed someone and they started. YouTube jumped in and made a comment about Area 51, and they effectively steered the narrative of what I was talking about and saying, well, this person is talking about a subject where there is frequently misinformation, so maybe we'll put you on the right path. And that right path they put the people on had points that go exactly against the narrative I was trying to talk about. So I said, I made a comment on YouTube. I said, hey, I didn't put this comment here. YouTube inserted this under my video, and it basically pours water all over the head of the Bob Lazar story. And that was almost like a little velvet needle that was in there to like, it looked like, oh, we're taking you to something called Britannica, and Britannica must be some sort of online encyclopedia, and some online encyclopedia must be telling you the truth. So Britannica had all these sorts of credible information about Area 51, then sprinkled somewhere in there in a little link that you clicked on. They had a whole video about how the Bob Lazar case was all bunk, and I'm like, wow, that was swift. And great, and thank you for YouTube for my narrative without my permission. So we do live in a day and age still. People have to be mindful. That's why one of the reasons I'm doing this
You're
podcast
absolutely right.
is
100% great point.
you got to stay on guard.
100% great point. You're a living example of that. And, if YouTube or any authority that had a counter viewpoint really had some guts and really wanted the truth, as opposed to pushing a narrative they want you to see, they would say, well, we'd like to have a discussion with you where we can dispute our points and have a debate. That would show sincere desire for truth. But when you just come along and say, hey, you're wrong, I'm right, here's the truth over here, without any real effort, then that says to me that they have an agenda. They're pushing something
Exactly.
that they want you to see. There's not room for debate or question. And that's when you, as a audience or as a person taking in information, you better start to raise your eyebrows and question.
Yeah, that's scary. And that scares me. And also, just to wrap this up, I just want to give 3 points left that I have. 3 quick points. I did watch, I think it was you that had put me onto The Killer and the Candyman. So there was the whole thing about John Gacy. I did a PowerPoint for my a class on serial killers when I was in college, when I got my criminal justice degree on John Gacy, so I know quite a bit about him. But I didn't necessarily see at the end of the Gacy story how there was a network of pedophiles and how Gacy was involved. I figured it to me, looked like a man who was desperate, that was caught for some terrible deeds, that was trying to throw the blame onto something else. Not that there couldn't be something like out there that exists, like Wonderland and these pedophile-esque websites, but whether or not Gacy himself was part of some larger network that was either being paid. I mean, nothing sufficient has come forward to quantify that. And also, Ted Bundy, as far as him working in some sort of a network or him being, the killings that he was accused of being multiple people. I mean, we have surviving witnesses of Ted Bundy. We have, there was a very famous incident at a park. It was Lake Samish, where he actually abducted 2 women in one day. They just vanished. Janice Ott and Denise Naslund, and they were eventually found killed. Their remains were found, and the author was basically saying, well, how come all these pictures at the park that day, none of them had Ted Bundy? I'm like, the guy was a cunning killer. I'm sure he's not going to hang around all day making himself too known. He's probably struck up a quick, friendly conversation with some of these women, pulled them off to a secluded area, even though there was parties going on by the park and music playing. I'm sure there was a parking lot somewhere where there wasn't much going on at some points, or an edge of a parking lot where he could have, invited them over. Like, hey, you want to? Who knows? You want to drink a beer? You want to smoke a joint? Or you want to help me out? Put my canoe on my car or something? And then the guy would wear a cast on his hand. He might have like battered some of these women in the head or attacked them quickly and viciously. And he was known for doing that. One of his abductors basically said he went from zero to the devil in a matter of a snap of a finger. So, knowing that about Ted Bundy, it doesn't surprise me how maybe he could have abducted,
Well,
lastly,
just to touch on that, those
and then,
couple of points real quick. As far as you mentioned the Candyman, and what was the other one?
yes,
The serial killer was
the Candyman and the Clown, John Gacy,
oh,
and I can
Gacy.
get you
Yes, yes.
the full name.
Um, I would say you got to watch the documentary. I hear you with that. Gacy's name pops up a lot. I just in other circumstances. So, for example, I just
Okay.
watched a documentary called "The Children of the Snow," and it goes into a whole pedophile ring that was taking place up in Michigan in an area. No, I'm sorry, up by Detroit. Yeah, Detroit, Michigan area. And this guy had his own private island. It was called the Oakland Child Murders, and this guy was bringing kids from out of underprivileged kids to this island, like it was supposed to be a campground, yada yada. So somewhere in the documentary, Gacy's name pops up as one of people who were, as they're trying to figure out who else was involved in the ring, they have been able to
Yeah.
locate Gacy's locations throughout his life before he was arrested, and he was in the area where the killings were taking place. Within a certain mileage range of that time. Whether that means he did it, no, it doesn't. But what I would say is these killers, we have no idea how many people they've killed. And I don't think what's on record is nearly close to what they probably did. So to continue to question and to continue to investigate potential leads with where they were, I think is important for victims and people in general to know the real truth and the extent of what they've done. So that's all I would put out there. Like, continue to question, continue to investigate, and of a Ted Bundy. I mean, they just came up with the fact that Bundy was involved in a killing. One of his earliest killings was involved right here in the East Coast, right by the Jersey Shore. That was one of his first killings ever on record.
Wow.
And there was a couple of girls coming home from the Jersey
Unbelievable.
Shore. What they found out, they do know that he did those murders, but they found out not too long before that, after that, there was another girl that was missing. Now, they don't know if Bundy did that, but it fits his, if I remember correctly, it fits very closely to his style of murder. So just going to show, like,
Yes.
things are still popping up, even though these guys are long gone. And there's a lot of people probably sitting around trying to figure out where, family members who have gone missing years ago, what happened, So, that's all. I think it's important to keep a questioning mind in that, when we come to these type of people, we don't really know everything they've done.
Yes. Yes, and I'll just insert one more before I get to my final point, playing off of what you just said. This is a good case for somebody to look up because I read this one or I was reading about this one recently because there was a macabre ending to where a serial killer is Israel Keys from Alaska had abducted and killed a woman, raped and killed her, took her from like some sort of like almost like a ready coffee type of place, some sort of like a coffee stand up in
Mhm.
Alaska, where he abducted her, said he was just going to take her for money, wind up taking her back to his house, taking him to his shed behind the house, raped her, killed her, went on a cruise with his family, came
Oh my
back,
God.
dressed her up, dressed the body up, and took a picture. And this is a now famous picture that has recently resurfaced on the internet because this happened back in 2012. But and this is the reason why he took a picture, put makeup on her, made her up, snapped a Polaroid of her next to a newspaper, made it look like she was still alive. And and then he sent that picture to the family so he can get them to send him money, which he did, and that's eventually how he got caught. When they put a sting against him, they were tracking the use of this money. That's how they caught this man. But he went to prison, killed himself, and he drew a note, something called he wrote a poem, and it said "The Ode to Murder," and under the poem was 11 skulls. And so a lot of people and investigators believe that those 11 skulls on the Ode to Murder was a sign that he was involved with many murders that are unsolved right now. And he even spoke about after he got caught, he would bury murder kits along hiking trails because he didn't want to carry stuff on him, so he would get caught. This was one of the Murder Inc.'s main hitmen, it said in the book, used to do that. He was accused of I forget the man's name, but he was accused of over 500 killings. And one of the things he would do was never carry a weapon, because if he ever got stopped by police, they would never be able to implicate him in doing anything wrong. So he would always get himself to the murder scene beforehand and figure out a way to do it with something right on hand, so it wasn't like he was ever could be implicated with anything on him. So that was just a interesting point
Let's look into that.
maybe something else for other people to look up. Israel Keys, yeah, and what the 11 skulls meant, the skulls that he drew on a piece of paper right before he killed himself in prison. Last thing I want to just wrap up on, because there's sure much more that you'd be able to give me, or what we would be able to get out of this, because I think there is a big question mark over this one. And I think this is one of the ones that fascinated a lot of people in America, very much so, was the killing of, or the murder of John Benet Ramsey.
Yeah.
And how to many um, investigators, it looked like it was maybe like an inside. This was right around Christmas time of 1996. It almost looked like, to investigators, there was an investigator that actually wanted off the case, or didn't even want to get part of the case, because he felt like it looked like an inside job. So it a lot of people think it was a staged abduction. And just some of the interesting facts were, out of I think 150 people, the mother of John Benet Ramsey looked like she's the one that fashioned off of a notepad that was found in the house, wrote a ransom letter. And the whole thing just didn't make a lot of sense to investigators. The father, who's also a suspect, conveniently found the body when he went to a very secluded room in the house, which would have not been known to maybe somebody that just broke into the house. So that was a key piece of evidence. There was undigested pineapple in her stomach, which didn't match up with the timeline that the father stated she had last eaten. And we're talking about, what was she at the time? She was a 6-year-old. So we're talking about a child, and the father and the mother should have known exactly what her habits were and what she ate or what she didn't eat, or what she didn't eat. And another interesting fact was that the fact that the opening of her vagina was double the size of a girl it should have been for that age. And the autopsy confirmed that. And normally that would be the premise for sexual abuse. So, yeah. So that was one of the facts that was in the book. And then when it came to the note, it was just strange, and stranger. It demanded exactly $118,000. Now think about that for a second. That's a pretty specific number, $118,000. Why would somebody mention that? Which also happened to be, coincidentally, the exact amount of money that John Ramsey had just gotten for a Christmas bonus. I mean, that's a huge coincidence, no? And it was very odd and very obscure. And then when the nature of the ransom note basically stated that the abductors were a small foreign faction and they were looking for this money. What sort of murder in the history of this country have we ever known, other than cartel activity? But when it comes to the abducting of children, when have we ever had a case where a small foreign faction would enter somebody's house in the middle of the night around Christmas and effectively sexually molest and then kill somebody's child and then demand? So the whole thing just reeked of being staged, like a domestic, one of the investigators didn't even want to be a part of this, because the guy said right from the get-go, he goes, this looks like a staged domestic homicide. So, just to leave it off on that, I'm not saying I know for a fact, because obviously I don't, but I'm just saying, just from the John Benet Ramsey, and that, I mean, just from my opinion, and this is obviously strictly my opinion, but it does seem to be strongly based on the evidence that there was some sort of, obviously somebody who knew her, and the fact that the handwriting matched the mother's handwriting. The amount that was asked on the ransom note was exactly what the father just got, like a very specific number, just got for a Christmas bonus. And then the nature of the ransom note being a foreign faction, it's just all so extremely odd, tied together, almost like, you know, screams that the father and mother were directly involved in the death of, or at least one of the parents, but more than likely they both knew who, that it was some sort of a domestic homicide and then possible sexual molestation. It looks like that. So I don't know if you saw any of that stuff or had any more interest in that part of the book.
No, that's fascinating. I have seen some stuff on that story, and there's a lot to question there. But there's a lot of question too with a lot of the things we brought up that, certainly maybe down the road we circle back on. I mean, I'd love to look more into that story, but any of these types of stories, these serial killers, and what's going on with these unsolved killings and such.
That sounds like a great idea, and I would love to, look into some of those books that you had mentioned also. That you had mentioned those books on the CIA and the Devil's Chessboard, and what was the other title? The other one of Ashes. You had mentioned there was another book there. You had mentioned.
Chaos.
I forget the title.
There's one called Chaos.
Okay,
that's one. One's the Devil's Chessboard, which is an interesting one. It gives you background. There's another one called Legacy of Ashes, which is pretty much a release of all the once undisclosed CIA documents. And if you like McGowan, and we touched a little bit on this, you might want to check out also Weird Scenes Inside the Canyon, Laurel Canyon Covert Ops, and the Death of the Hippie Dream. That was another book that I'm currently reading from McGowan right now. So check it out.
Thank you very much for coming on Not Media, Jesse. I certainly appreciate you coming on. A wealth of information. The book you provided me was a wealth of information, and it was good having this discussion. It definitely opened up my mind to some things that I want to look into more, and a lot of things that I didn't know. And it was good to have your perspective of this book to kind of tie together a lot of like what I going into this interview, I still felt that way about the book, that a lot of it I was kind of still grasping at, like exactly how this all ties together. But you summed it up in a very concise way, in a very accurate way. So overall, great book, a lot of great information, a lot of unknowns, and that's what we're here for. We're here to kind of just keep pushing forward and trying to figure out what some of the truths in this world are that we're not maybe specifically being told about or taught about in schools, or just from what the current mainstream media is offering us as an explanation. So again, I certainly appreciate having you on.
Yeah.
And you enjoy the rest of your evening. All right.
Hey, great time, good conversation. Sounds good. Thanks, man.
Yeah. Thanks a lot. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you all for listening to this episode, and thank you everyone who has chosen a life of service. This is not just military, fire, police, and EMS, but also anyone who has taken their talents and passions and used them for the service and betterment of others and this world. I'm not saying goodbye. I'm saying until next time. This is your host, at Not Media, JP, signing off. Stay well, everyone.